So first of all, welcome to Kafka Summit 2021, Dusty.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking time to share with us your experience at Instacart. I think a lot of our audience will find this experience very interesting.
Fantastic.
To get us started, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Instacart.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I guess we could, instead of Fireside, we can call it Surrounding One Fern instead of two ferns. So I've been in software leadership for about 30 years and seen a lot of changes over the time. And I've been lucky enough to be kind of working in some very fast-moving companies kind of right at the edge. And between Life360 and Slack and now at Instacart, it's been a really wild ride. At Instacart, I've been blessed to been offered an opportunity to hire and coach a group of leaders that span data engineering, security, cloud, platform, dev productivity, and governance, risk, and compliance. And so it's a broad, diverse group of really talented engineers, and we're really excited about what we're doing there.
Yeah, that's a great journey you have had so far. Not everyone is necessarily familiar with Instacart as a business. Could you share with us a little bit what Instacart is as a business?
Sure. Instacart, related to Jay, Instacart was born, as software, right? And some of these companies were born as software, and it's a digital marketplace. And I think that from that perspective, our mission is to help people find the food that they love and get access to the food they love, and then spend more time enjoying it together. And as a company, we are very distributed. We have software organizations that have a lot of agency and a lot of focus for the various areas of our marketplace. So whether it's the customers who are shopping or the shoppers who are delivering or the retailers who are putting their store online or the brands trying to reach the customers, each of those areas has a software team that's really focused on them.
Yeah, that's good. And earlier you were sharing with me an interesting anecdotal thing about Instacart, that Instacart actually has more pickup locations than all the Starbucks and McDonald's in the US combined. That's impressive.
Yeah, so 50,000 locations between the US and Canada. It's a really interesting trivia that I just found out recently. Sometimes I ask that question to people sometimes, and people have really wild notions of how many. I ask, how many Starbucks do you think there are in the United States? And someone said, 1 million. I'm like, well, no, not 1 million, but a lot. But yeah, it's really remarkable how fast it's grown. Instacart now is servicing, pretty much a national infrastructure for food delivery.
Yeah, that's good. So let's talk about the technology. So what are the problems you and your team are trying to solve at Instacart?
Yeah, so, it traces a little bit back. If you look back at Slack, I had the honor of working with some of the folks who really are the kind of founders of the DevOps movement at Flickr. And really that evolved into this concept of service ownership. And at Instacart, as a distributed company with lots of different divisions working very fast and evolving in many different directions, what we really want to do is, what I have found is that startups are really good at making things, they're not as good at owning things. Yeah. And so the problem I feel like we're really trying to solve is that how do we make service ownership efficient, right? How do we reduce the cost of service ownership, which is the mission of my organization. And that problem spans lots of areas, and one of the specific ones and the reasons I'm here today is that on the data engineering side, how do we create ownership of data across the organization? And the data mesh concept is really central to what we're trying to do there.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I think data mesh and event streaming, that's what we've seen a lot of the changes in other organizations as well. Let's talk about the impact of pandemic, COVID. Yeah. I think last year, we have been through this pandemic thing, and a lot of the companies, especially retail, have been impacted a lot by this. So what's the impact of COVID to Instacart, and what are the challenges you guys have to face?
Some of our challenges are not dissimilar to everyone else's. Mm-hmm. Suddenly having to work from home and the stress of doing your work and teaching your children school at home and still trying to push a business forward. I think those are always, everyone has kind of gone through that over the last couple of years. But Instacart certainly had a relatively unique place in that space. And what we kind of have done the math on is that we experienced about 10 years worth of growth in about 8 weeks. Yeah. And so having been part of some of the fastest growing companies ever, when I joined Instacart in January 2020, I had no idea what was coming. And that type of scale was really challenging for us, right? To not just for our software, but for our business processes, for pretty much all of our systems. And as our team was really talented and worked really hard to kind of get through that, we were able to support a lot of retail that had to transform overnight. to become e-commerce companies. And they really needed to have a really positive experience with the customers. It's really kind of a bummer to go online, order something, and then realize it's not going to come, right? And so that kind of quality-focused mentality that we had internally and on the service we had for customers, I think was really the hallmark of how we got through the pandemic itself. But in many ways, the scale was just really remarkable and unlike anything I've ever seen before.
Yeah, that's definitely a great story. I think the pandemic, in some sense, accelerated a lot of the digital transformation for a lot of the organizations like you guys.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about Kafka Confluent. So
Yeah.
could you share us a little bit story about the journey you guys have with data in motion, Kafka and Confluent?
Yeah. So, with Confluent specifically, at Slack, we ran a very large Kafka instance on the Meadow with VMs, and we brought our own sidecars and transformed our event pipeline to Kafka. And we were really excited about that mentality. And when I got to Instacart, one of the things that happens with that really, really rapid growth is you don't have the staff and you can't wait around to build the engineering team to build these very large systems and take care of them at scale. Yeah. And so we knew very early on that we wanted an aggressive managed services strategy, whether that was with our cloud providers on databases or whether that is observability. But certainly for data in motion and our core nervous system or backbone, we knew that Kafka was definitely the tool that we wanted to use. And then the question was, how are we going to use it? We started trying with our cloud provider service, and it was able for us to get up and running really quickly. We were able to kind of provision things and get data, get our event stream starting to run. But we found that the support system just wasn't there. The expertise wasn't there. The experience wasn't there. You never want to call your service provider and they have to go find their Kafka expert. That's a problem, right? And so for us, it was a very natural kind of evolution to say, hey, let's call Confluent and talk to them. These are the founders. These are the people who know it the best, who do it the best. And it really was transformational for us. And I think that's a real secret to managed services in general is you want to be with folks who are completely committed and devoted and really experts in the system that they're supporting. And so that's our journey to get to Confluent itself. And the process is kind of evolving. And I think, I mentioned early on, our distributed and our service ownership model, where we are trying to help software teams own their software better, extends into the data space. Yeah. And I'm really excited about that. And working with our director of data engineering and executing this data mesh strategy, we're excited about where Confluent's going there and partnering with them on kind of frontiering that space.
That's great. That's a great story to know. And what are some of the use cases of Kafka and Confluent you guys had in Instacart?
Yeah, so it's some of them I feel like are almost table stakes, but maybe that's just the world I live in. But certainly these ideas of a consolidated event stream so you can have a customer 360 solution. Right. That's to me a very central use case because in today's world, you can't just look at a graph and look at P50 and say, oh, here's my P50, here's my P90. You have to understand every customer's experience. And if a customer's having a bad day, you have to know who that customer is and how was their bad day. And you have to make that visible in your company. And you have to make that visible in real time because the software is evolving literally, with experiments and A/B flags and whatnot all day long. And so I feel like that is now almost the de facto way that a lot of the modern software companies are running, and that is central to our use case. Yeah. I think in addition to that, the timeliness of data, right? Like how you're moving data around the company. Oftentimes it's the pump and dump and query, right? Just dump it in a database and we'll run queries. But I think a lot of companies start out and they don't even realize that they have unbounded data problems until you start getting poured petabytes of data in a week and all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, I can't query this anymore. There are billions and billions and billions of rows. And so we need a different solution. And so for us, moving from kind of, what I would call older ETL models to change data capture and streaming changes, not just to data warehouses or to cold storage, but also to, product teams that want to receive updates right away. And so the timeliness of data and of either its analytics or of order information across the company was a really important part of that backbone, right? Yeah. I think the last one that is less like table stakes and more specific to Instacart is we have a really complicated problem. And if you think of 50,000 stores across, United States and Canada, the inventory of those stores really matters. And none of those, these are grocery stores, or these are not like really high-tech companies. They, the idea of knowing what the inventory is in 50,000 stores at any given time is a really hard problem to solve, because if you go to order milk and it's not there, you get upset. So we don't want you to order something that's not there. So we're constantly trying to get updates. Yeah. And a lot of that was using pretty older batch technology, kind of file exchanges. And we have really kind of transformed that and now providing APIs for real-time updates. Because ultimately, it's better for the retailer, it's better for our customer, and it's actually cheaper for us than to just dump all the data in and then try and query it every time someone's looking for milk.
Yeah, definitely. I think providing this like real-time experience to all the products, like catalog, right, customer service, that's what a trend we have seen in a lot of other retailers and similar companies. Yeah. So let's talk about multi-cloud. I think a lot of companies, of course, are moving towards cloud. And then when they move into cloud, often they're thinking about this multi-cloud or hybrid strategy. What's your view on this?
So I think it's a hot topic. There's a lot of people with takes on it, both positive and negative. I think it's a really personal choice for every company, depending on what their strategy is. My personal belief is that multi-cloud makes sense, not so much in I want to take workload A and split it into two different places and kind of maybe compare them or have them compete. For me, it's more of like, where does this workload work best? What is the best of breed service that I can use, right? And that may be different cloud providers, that may be different managed service providers. And that's one way where you will see the kind of distribution of workloads across multiple clouds. The other way is through mergers and acquisitions is pretty common, right? Like, again, oftentimes cloud sales folks will get mad at me when I say, cloud's a cloud. They're like, no, our cloud is better, it's different. But to some degree, that's true. And so I think that the choice you make as a company early on is important, but you develop your tooling around it. And when you acquire a company like that, oftentimes it doesn't make sense to migrate them just so that they can do the same thing on a different cloud. And so you have this multi-cloud strategy as you accumulate these parts. And I think central to all of that is the interoperability. Right? Companies that want to grow, whether it's through merger or whether they want to expand internationally, now you need to talk about more than one data center. And at the root of that is like, what is your data interoperability strategy, right? And we saw some examples earlier where how can I replicate data, geographically? How can I replicate data between data centers or between cloud providers? And that is really the number one problem that you have in some of these integration efforts, right? And so I think it's exciting to kind of lay those tracks, if you will, and the groundwork using Confluent.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that the kind of portability to be able to, whether to use the best breed of service, no matter where that service is, and dealing with merger and acquisition, right? That's, I think, a trend that we have seen in a lot of other places as well. Yeah,
it's funny because I do think that lift and shift is probably overplayed a little bit. I think we were talking about it before where, in the old days, well, it's just Linux. Just run it over there, right? But there's a lot of tooling in today's version of that. It's just Kubernetes. Just run it over there. But I think the tooling that surrounds every cloud provider is somewhat unique. And what's interesting is that companies like Confluent will come meet you where you are, right? And so I think the idea of being proficient on all clouds is really important for managed service providers and maybe less important for someone like Instacart.
Right, that's great. Okay, one last question for you, Dusty. Sure. What's next for you and your team at Instacart?
Well, I think that we really want to innovate and push this service ownership model, right? And certainly our data mesh strategy and Confluent is central. It's a component of that. But we believe that teams need to understand security, need to understand reliability, quality, performance, and all of those things. And we're hoping to build the infrastructure and tooling to make that cheaper for them. For us, the central nervous system of all of that is data and the data in motion that comes by kind of moving from a batch system to a real-time system. And the data mesh kind of experimentation and innovation that's coming and our partnership with you is something that we're really excited about.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, with this, thank you for your time, for sharing your experience with us at Kafka Summit. And I wish you continued success of using Kafka and Confluent at Instacart. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you.